It's like a mini India.
Yeah.
There are too many Indians here.
We're Canadian, we're multicultural, but come on.
If we're going to their country, we will have to adapt to their culture, right? They should do the same thing here.
Well, I do feel like I'm a stranger in my own country.
In the bustling urban centers of Canada, a silent transformation is underway, reshaping the fabric of the nation's identity and future. With each passing year, Canada welcomes thousands of migrants from around the world, drawn by the promise of opportunity and prosperity. The country has long been a popular destination for immigrants from around the world, with the country's openness to newcomers being a source of both pride and controversy. In recent years, one of the most notable trends has been the significant influx of immigrants from China and India, sparking concerns that this demographic shift amounts to a new form of colonization. Data from the IRCC reveals that India provided 118,095 new permanent residents to Canada as of 2023, more than a quarter of the total 437,120 new permanent residents for 2022. However, the number of new permanent residents to Canada from India was 7.7%, or 9,845 people, less last year than the 127,940 Indians who made Canada their home in 2021. In the number 2 spot of the most important sources of new permanent residents to Canada, China upped its game last year by providing 31,815 immigrants to Canada, up 2.6%, or 805 people from the 31,010 Chinese who immigrated to the country in 2021. This influx is baneful and possesses a threat to the economic, social, and political stability of Canada. Records show that more than 7 billion Canadian dollars was laundered in British Columbia in 2018. Some of the laundered money flowed into the illegal drug trade, some into luxury cars. More than $5 billion was laundered through the real estate market, leading to a 5% increase in housing costs. According to the National Bank of Canada, Chinese buyers accounted for 1/3 of the $38 billion of residential home sales in Vancouver in 2015. While foreign investment can bring economic benefits, the concentration of Chinese buyers in Vancouver's housing market has fueled concerns about affordability and speculation. While immigration has long been a defining feature of Canadian society, the scale and impact of Chinese and Indian immigration in recent decades are unprecedented, raising questions about the long-term implications for Canada's identity, economy, and social cohesion. In this video, we will delve into the complex dynamics of immigration from China and India to Canada, exploring the challenges it presents and examining how this mass immigration is subtly leading to the country's colonization. We are led to believe that Canada's immigration policy serves the national interest and is essential for economic growth, to fill labor shortages, and to offset an aging and diminishing population. Canadians were also made to believe that most immigrants are selected because they possess the education, trades, skills, and training to meet the nation's labor force demands. These assertions need to be challenged because they do not bear up under examination. They have become myths used by governments and pro-immigration advocates to justify unreasonably high immigration levels. This high immigration level from both countries is undoubtedly putting a strain on the survival and sustenance of Canadians. In other words, Canada is being colonized. To set the stage for this exposition, let us take a look at the actual meaning of colonization, especially in this context. The concept of colonization is a complex one, typically involving the occupation of land by settlers, the economic exploitation of the colonized territory, and the acquisition of political control. While Canada's history is certainly marked by colonial practices, some argue that the current wave of Chinese and Indian immigration exhibits similar patterns, with far-reaching implications for the country's social, economic, and political landscape. One of the key aspects of colonization is the occupation of land by settlers, often displacing or marginalizing the indigenous population. In the case of Canada, the arrival of Chinese and Indian immigrants has dramatically altered the demographic makeup of many communities, particularly in urban centers like Toronto and Vancouver. According to the latest census data, the proportion of Canada's population that identifies as Chinese or South Asian has risen steadily in recent decades. Just over 7 million people living in Canada at the time of the 2021 census reported total 5.5 million, or partial 1.5 million, Asian ethnicity, making it the third largest population group in Canada, following European at 19.1 million and North American at 10.3 million. Just under 3.6 million Canadians reporting full or partial Asian heritage lived in Ontario at the time of the 2021 census, accounting for just over half of Canada's total Asian population. British Columbia was home to Canada's second largest Asian community at just under 1.5 million. This represents a significant increase from the 1980s, when these groups collectively made up just over 10% of the total population. Moreover, the geographic distribution of these immigrant communities is noteworthy, with concentrations in certain neighborhoods and cities. For example, in the Greater Toronto Area, the proportion of residents identifying as Chinese or South Asian exceeds 50% in some municipalities. Similarly, the city of Vancouver is now home to the highest percentage of Chinese Canadians in the country. According to Statistics Canada 2021 data, the largest non-white ethnic group in Metro Vancouver is Chinese, comprising 19.6% of the population. In recent times, these numbers have risen to exponential values when juxtaposed to previous years. This demographic shift has led to concerns that certain areas are becoming enclaves with the dominance of Chinese and Indian cultures and languages, potentially alienating or excluding the established Canadian population. Critics argue that this parallels the historical process of colonization, where settlers gradually displace and marginalize the indigenous inhabitants. Colonization is often characterized by deceit, the economic exploitation of the colonized territory, with the resources and labor of the local population being harnessed to benefit the colonial power. In terms of deceit and lack of transparency, one of the primary drivers of this immigration has been the demand for skilled labor, particularly in the technology, healthcare, and engineering sectors. The Canadian government has actively recruited skilled workers from these countries through various immigration programs, such as the Express Entry System and the Provincial Nominee Program. While this has helped to address labor shortages in certain industries, critics argue that it has also led to the exploitation of these immigrant workers. In the Greater Toronto Area, a massive number of immigrants are working in jobs that do not match their skills and education level. Many are reliant on their employers for their immigration status. In the case of Chinese and Indian immigration to Canada, some argue that a similar dynamic is at play. The influx of immigrants has put significant pressure on the Canadian housing market, leading to skyrocketing costs that price out many long-term residents. This has been particularly acute in cities like Vancouver and Toronto, where the influence of wealthy Chinese and Indian investors has been a major factor in the housing affordability crisis. In Vancouver, for example, studies and numerous reports bear witness to such forms of subliminal colonization by the Chinese in the supposed Great White North. According to a new study by the National Bank of Canada, Chinese homebuyers accounted for nearly one-third of Vancouver's real estate market during 2015, spending approximately $9.6 billion of the $29 billion of total real estate sales. National Bank financial analyst Peter Rutledge, who compiled the data, said that Chinese homebuyers occupied 33% of the total housing volume in Vancouver's real estate market and 14% of purchases in Toronto, or about $6.7 billion of the $47 billion in deals. Housing critics have long debated that offshore buyers are driving real estate prices in Vancouver higher than locals can afford. This has contributed to a situation where the average home price in the city has drastically increased by 241% since January 2005, with the average home price in Greater Vancouver at $1,302,794, which rose 0.6% annually. Similarly, in the Greater Toronto Area, a 2017 report from the Chinese website Juwei.com highlighted that 46% of Chinese users were looking at properties in Montreal, 44% in Vancouver, 41% in Toronto, and 9% in Calgary. This has been a major driver of the region's skyrocketing housing costs, which have increased by over 50% since 2016. Critics argue that this trend represents a form of economic colonization where the resources and wealth of the Canadian housing market are being exploited by foreign investors, often at the expense of the local population. They contend that the dominance of Chinese and Indian investors in the real estate market is distorting the economy and undermining the ability of Canadians to afford homes in their own communities. Overall, the economic exploitation of immigrant labor and the outsized influence of Chinese and Indian investors in the Canadian housing market has contributed to a growing sense of unease among many Canadians, who feel their economic interests are being compromised by this demographic shift. As the debate over immigration and its impact on the country continues, these concerns are likely to remain a prominent point of contention. The final aspect of colonization is the acquisition of political control, which can manifest in various ways. In the case of Chinese and Indian immigration to Canada, there are concerns that this demographic shift is translating into growing political influence and even attempts to shape the country's policies and institutions. One of the most prominent examples is the alleged interference of the Chinese government in Canadian politics. There have been numerous reports of the Chinese government attempting to influence the outcome of elections, fund pro-China candidates, and undermine the political autonomy of the Canadian government. This has led to heightened concerns about foreign interference and the potential erosion of Canadian sovereignty. Similarly, the growing political clout of the Indian diaspora in Canada has also raised eyebrows. Indian Canadian organizations and advocacy groups have become increasingly vocal in their efforts to shape the country's policies on issues like immigration, foreign relations, and even the Kashmir conflict. Some critics argue that this represents a form of transnational colonialism, where the interests of the home country are being projected onto the host nation. Another factor that has drawn the attention of observers is the alleged influence of the World Economic Forum, or WEF, on immigration policies and demographic shifts in Canada. The WEF, a global non-profit organization that brings together political and business leaders, has been the subject of numerous conspiracy theories and accusations of attempting to shape the world order. In the case of Canada, some believe that the WEF's Great Reset agenda, which calls for a fundamental transformation of the global economy and society, is being implemented through the country's immigration policies. They argue that the influx of Chinese and Indian immigrants is part of a broader plan to reshape the demographic and cultural landscape of Canada in line with the WEF's globalist vision. While the evidence for this claim is largely circumstantial, the connections between the WEF, the Canadian government, and the country's immigration policies have raised concerns among critics. They point to the close ties between the WEF and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, as well as the organization's stated goals of promoting diversity, inclusion, and equity as evidence of a coordinated effort to transform Canada's societal makeup. The ongoing influx of Chinese and Indian immigrants to Canada and the concerns that this represents a form of colonization have had a range of adverse effects on the country. These include the displacement and marginalization of the existing population, the exploitation of immigrant labor, the erosion of Canadian sovereignty, and the potential undermining of the country's social cohesion and cultural identity. One of the most significant impacts has been the displacement and marginalization of the existing Canadian population, particularly in urban centers. As Chinese and Indian immigrants have come to dominate certain neighborhoods and industries, long-term residents have felt increasingly alienated and excluded. This has led to tensions, resentment, and a growing sense of disenfranchisement among the native-born population. The alleged interference of foreign governments, particularly China, in Canadian politics has also raised serious concerns about the erosion of Canadian sovereignty. The accusations of attempts to influence elections, fund pro-China candidates, and shape the country's policies have sparked fears that Canada's democratic institutions are being undermined by external forces. This can potentially undermine the public's trust in the political system and the government's legitimacy. The parallels between the current trends and the historical process of colonization, characterized by the occupation of settlers, the economic exploitation of the colonized territory, and the acquisition of political control, have led some observers to view the situation with increasing alarm. Meanwhile, with the passage of time, the future of Canada's identity and sovereignty may very well depend on how this complex issue is navigated in the years to come. If you like this video, hit the like button and help us spread the word. And don't forget to subscribe to get notifications on our latest news and analysis. In the meantime, check out one of these videos here to learn more. Thanks for watching.